So if you have any questions about that, I'm trying to skim over some of the stuff that's self-explanatory, but you can ask at the end. So common errors on the application form, leaving sections incomplete. People often just don't fill out some of the sections, don't give us some of the information we're asking for. If you do that, we're going to have to come back and ask for you to submit a new application to just give us all that information. Inaccurate GPS coordinates. That's something that we have to log into our database as the GPS coordinates, and we actually have a map that we offer that has all of the different permits, all active stormwater permits, industrial, post-construction, etc. And that's very helpful for a lot of not only the permittees, but consultants that might be submitting an expansion to something and they need to check and see if there's an existing permit there. So these GPS coordinates are really important for not just so that we know where it is, but also for the long-term health of the program so that people can find these projects. The signing official on the permit application is another issue that we commonly see. So what the rules require is if it's a corporation or an LLC, then the person signing the application has to be a principal executive officer at the level of vice president or an authorized representative. So that's something that we get tripped up on a lot. In a lot of cases, an LLC applies and somebody signs the permit and we don't know who that person is. We don't have anything that tells us, they're the vice president or they're a company official or anything like that. So I believe, so right here, this is another part of the rules. We need, whenever it's a corporation or a limited liability corporation, documentation from the Secretary of State saying that it's an active corporation in good standing, and documentation from the Secretary of State or other official documentation showing the titles and positions held by the individual who signs the application. So if you go to the Secretary of State's website and you do the business search, it usually has the list of company officials. So if the person signing the application is not listed on that, what we can accept is something from the company or even just a letter from one of those officials that says, this person has authority to sign on behalf of the company. So we just need something that says who that person is and that they have the ability to sign for that company. If the company or the applicant is a partnership, then it has to be one of the partners. If it's a proprietorship, the proprietor of the business, or if it's a government project, municipal, state, or a public entity, then it can be a principal executive officer, ranking official, or duly authorized employee. So in those cases, we'll often get things like DPW folks, things like that. So, DPW manager, or sometimes it's a county administrator, somebody like that. Another common error that we see on the application form has to do with the drainage area table, which looks like this. This is a table that's on the 3rd page of the application form. And what we're looking for here is to break down the drainage area to each stormwater control measure. So if you have 3 SCMs on site, for example, each one of these, the first 3 should be broken down into what's actually draining to each of those SCMs. If it's a low density site and you don't have multiple SCMs, then you can just put the entire project area under one drainage area thing. And we also ask, because sometimes there's projects that have more than 4 SCMs. If you have more than 4 SCMs, just please duplicate this table and submit another page that has all of the different drainage areas. Or you can even just take this table and put it into Excel and submit a separate Excel sheet as an attachment to the application. So whatever works best for you. And then the last thing on the application form is the property owner authorization and applicant's authorization. So we have these 2 different authorizations that people often confuse. The first one is the property owner authorization. So this is to be signed in the situation where the applicant is not the property owner. So if the applicant is a developer or is leasing a property, we need to have the person who actually owns the property fill out this section and have it signed and notarized. If the applicant is the property owner, this part does not need to be completed at all. So sometimes we'll see, the applicant is the property owner, they complete the property owner authorization, not the applicant certification. And in that case, we're going to have an add info request because the applicant certification is the part that has to be signed and notarized by the applicant on every single application. So this part always has to be done. Property owner authorization only has to be done when the applicant is not the property owner. So another documentation error is this deed restriction form. That the form you see right now is what we have on our website. It's something that we're going to be updating in the short future to make it a little bit more up to date with the rules, with the 2017 rule change. But deed restriction forms are required for all subdivisions just to say, this is the amount of built upon area that's going to be allowed on the lots in this subdivision. And we need it for both high density and low density sites. The high density site is to make sure that there's not more built upon area going to an SCM than what that SCM is designed to treat. And the low density subdivision form is to make sure that that built upon area is not going above the low density threshold. So whenever you have a subdivision, we're going to need a form like this. This is actually just an example. It's not the only form you can use. If you wanted to create something of your own, we could probably accept it, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone do that because we offer this form. So it just has to be completed, have the built upon area either put right there on the form if all of the lots are the same, or you can just submit a table, an Excel sheet, something like that, that has the built upon area broken down by lot. Another form that's often not submitted is the Supplement Easy form. This form summarizes the development. It helps us to take a quick look at everything and see if all of that stuff meets the MDC and kind of get a general sense of how this is designed. It's something that also helps the permittee going forward after the project is approved, because let's say in the future they need to do some maintenance and you have somebody who doesn't know how to read the plans, but they have the Supplement Easy that says this pond has to be 2 feet deep or something like that. It's something that's a great tool for us as reviewers. It's something that's great for the people who are submitting it, who get to take all this stuff and compare it directly to the MDC and make sure before you submit it that everything is good. And it's something that's great to have for the permittee later on. So we require this to be filled out. We also updated it recently to allow you to put in low density information. So we require it for both high density and low density. And all of the info here should match the plans and the applications and be backed up, or match the plans, the application, and be backed up by the calculations. So if you put, say, a drain time for an infiltration system, we're not just going to accept it if it's on the Supplement Easy form. We're going to need to see the calculations where that came from. So those numbers should be consistent throughout. Sometimes we'll have one number in a calculation that doesn't match what's in the supplement, or the supplement says there's a certain amount of built upon area and the application says something different. Just make sure that those are all consistent. All projects also require an O&M plan and agreement. This is a picture of the O&M Easy form that we offer. This is what we get most often from people. It allows you to just go in and say how many SCMs you have. It'll come up with a generic maintenance plan, and the applicant signs it, gets it notarized, and it meets the O&M maintenance, or the O&M agreement and plan requirements. So some of the common issues we see with this, sometimes we'll only get the agreement because this is in an Excel file and there's a macro that you have to run to update it. So let's say you put in that there's one wet pond, there will be something that comes up in red that says click to update O&M manual. you have to hit that to load the actual operation and maintenance plan. Also, in the low density area, we broke it down into 3 different types because low density has multiple options. You can have all overland flow, you can use vegetated conveyances, or you can use curb outlet swales. So that's another thing that we see sometimes. Somebody just puts in low density, doesn't pick which type, and so the plan might not match exactly what you're designing. And similar to the supplement easy form, something I didn't mention, always use the most up-to-date version, because this is something that's been changed throughout the years, different rule changes. So sometimes we'll see an operation maintenance plan or a supplement easy form from 10 years ago that doesn't really match what the rules say today. Another common documentation error is not submitting a geotechnical investigation. We do need soil testing for a lot of different SCMs. Infiltration systems, bioretention cells, permeable pavement, sand filters, and dry ponds all need some level of soil testing, mainly for seasonal high water table requirements, but some of them also need infiltration testing. So this is something that we're going to ask for on any project that has one of these SCMs. So for any of these SCMs, it has to investigate the depth of the seasonal high water table, and if it's relying on infiltration, we need the infiltration testing as well within the footprint of the SCM. Right, see how I'm doing on time. Ooh, maybe I put too much information in here. All right, now I'm going to get into some of the common design issues and go through some of the specific SCMs and point out some of the things that we see. And I'm going to go kind of quickly here to make sure there's time for questions. So hopefully I don't go too quickly, but if I do, hopefully that'll be time for any questions that we have. So one of the common design errors is using the pre-2017 SCM requirements for projects that the new MDC apply to. So any new project now has to meet the current MDC. If it was something that received an approval before the current rules took effect, it can be designed in accordance with previous design requirements. But if it's something new, it's going to have to meet the MDC. Some of the common issues, some of the big changes that we've seen that we had in 2017, level spreader and filter strips are no longer required for a lot of SCM designs. All SCMs can be used for peak flow control now. So infiltration and a lot of other SCMs couldn't before. Now they can be. And the sand filter requirements are significantly changed. So a lot of the time we see people design sand filters in accordance with the old design manual requirements instead of the new MDC. So that's a specific SCM where you should definitely look and make sure that you're meeting the new MDC. And all fast track projects must meet the current design requirements. The fast track process came into existence with the 2017 rules. So anything that's being designed in accordance with that has to meet the MDC, and that's something that's written into the rules. So the minimum design criteria are broken down into the general and the SCM specific MDC. So the general MDC apply to all projects. So I'm going to go through some of the common general MDC mistakes that we see. The first is sizing. So MDC 1 says the design volume shall take into account the runoff at build out from all surfaces draining to the system. Drainage from offsite areas may be bypassed. The combined design volume of all SCM shall be sufficient to handle the required storm depth. So the rules require that only the net increase in built upon area has to be treated. Any offsite built upon area and anything up to the existing amount of built upon area can be bypassed and doesn't have to be treated. However, if it is draining to the SCM has to be designed to treat the design storm from everything draining to it. So you can't, let's say you have 2 acres of built upon area and 1 acre is existing. You can bypass that 1 acre of existing built upon area. But if 2 acres are draining to the SCM, it has to meet the design criteria for the total volume coming off of those 2 acres. And that's just to make sure that it's actually going to get the pollutant removal that we're looking for in the field, rather than the actual just theoretical increase. General MDC 4 is erosion protection. It just says that the inlets and outlets of SCMs have to be designed to prevent erosion. For this, all we're looking for is calculations for riprap or whatever the other outlet protection is that are done in accordance with the current erosion control planning and design manual. These are things that are usually the consultants have done, but sometimes aren't submitted to us. MDC 6 requires that SCMs have a method to draw down any standing water. The goal of this is if there's some kind of failure in the SCM, maybe an outlet gets clogged or it's an infiltration system that fails, there needs to be a way to drain all of that water so that it can be remedied. So the big issue with dewatering is that it's something that's not exactly part of the design, it's something that's planned for. So a lot of the time, it's not addressed in the calculation documents or on the plans, and people in the supplement easy form just put other in that field, but they don't explain what the actual method is going to be. So if you put other, then at the bottom of the supplement easy, explain what the other method is. We do recommend pumping it down instead of using drawdown orifices at the bottom of an outlet structure, just to prevent all of that sediment that settled out from being washed out through the outlet structure. MDC 8 and 9 are for maintenance access and easements. I generally group these two together because MDC 8 requires that there's a maintenance access to allow you to actually get to the SCM and perform any required maintenance. MDC 9 requires that anything on privately owned land be in a recorded drainage easement, and it has to include the maintenance access. And so since the maintenance access has to extend to the nearest right-of-way, then easement also has to extend to the nearest right-of-way. So that's something that should be shown on plans. It doesn't have to be recorded upfront. It's something that we ask for a copy of after construction is done and everything's been recorded. And then the O&M plan and agreement, I talked about that earlier, so I'm not going to go through all of that. It just has to be submitted, as I said earlier, and avoid those mistakes. So now I'm going to talk about some of the common low density issues. Probably the biggest one is excessive piping or concentration of stormwater. So this is actually out of the rules. This is what the rules say about piping on low density developments. A minimal amount of non-vegetated conveyances for erosion protection or piping for driveways or culverts under a road shall be allowed by the permitting authority when it cannot be avoided. So people sometimes read this to mean, okay, I'm going to design my site and then put in the least amount of piping I need. Well, that's not what we're looking for. We want that site to be designed so that it doesn't need piping. So if we see anything where you're collecting a lot of stormwater in pipes, you're not going to get a low density permit, even if it's below the threshold for low density. We require vegetated conveyances in those situations. And the second point here, insufficient design of vegetated conveyances. So sometimes we'll see side slopes that are greater than 3:1, or we won't get calculations showing that the 10-year storm won't cause erosion. So we need to see all of that. We want to see the drainage areas broken down by each vegetated conveyances, or each vegetated conveyance. And that applies even to roadside ditches. So sometimes somebody says, oh, we don't have any swales, we just have these ditches, so we don't need to submit calculations. Well, we also want to know that those ditches aren't going to erode. So that's something that should be submitted for any low density design. The next few are pretty simple, so I'm just going to mention them and breeze over them. Not showing the proposed contours. Sometimes somebody just puts a line or puts an arrow that says, oh, there's a ditch or a swale here. Well, we want to see what the actual contours are so that we can check and make sure that that's going to meet the 3:1 requirements, and so that we can check the drainage areas and things like that. And not delineating the drainage areas is another common issue. Also specifying non-vegetated liner. Sometimes somebody says, there's going to be straw or something like that in it. The rules require that it's vegetated, so it needs to either be seeded or sopped. And I'm going to go into curb outlet swales, which are an alternative. And I don't actually have the rule reference in here, but a curb outlet swale is an alternative low density design where you can use curb and gutter as long as you have breaks in the curb that lets runoff outlet to a swale that's at least 100 feet long. This doesn't mean that you can just collect everything in pipes, empty it into a swale that's 100 feet long. It has to be these regular cuts in the curb. So it should look something like, the curb cut that you see on this slide is draining to a rain garden instead of a swale, but it should be a similar curb cut to that at regular intervals to the swales. All right, now I'm going to get into some of the Scm specific MDC mistakes. And I'm going to go through only a handful of the primary SCMs because these are the ones we see in probably 95% of applications. So infiltration systems in 2017, the MDC the requirements were updated, and infiltration has a lot more flexibility now and some stripped down requirements. So the two biggest issues we see are with MDC 1, which requires a soil investigation to get the hydraulic properties and characteristics within the proposed footprint. So we need soil testing that has to be in the proposed footprint of the infiltration system to show that you have at least 2 foot separation from the seasonal high water table, and to establish the hydraulic conductivity, which will then be used to figure out whether or not the SCM can drain in time. And the second common issue with infiltration systems is not providing pretreatment. Pretreatment is required for all infiltration systems. We don't specify the type of pretreatment that's required or design requirements because we want to give a lot of flexibility. So this can be things like sumps and catch basins, screens on roof drains if it's rooftop runoff, or filter strips, swales, forebays, etc. So those are the two common ones that we see for infiltration. Bioretention cells, there's a couple more. The bioretention and MDC are a little bit more robust than infiltration. So the first one, separation from seasonal high water table. I'm not going to go into that because I already talked about how we need geotech investigations for a lot of different SCMs. The maximum ponding depth and peak attenuation volume is something that confuses people a little bit. So MDC2 says the maximum ponding depth for the design volume is 12 inches above the planting surface. And the peak attenuation volume can be stored up to 24 inches above the planting surface, as long as the outlet is at least 18 inches above the planting surface. And so what that means is your design volume, so say you're outside of the coast, your design storm is a 1-inch rainfall. You calculate your design volume from that 1-inch rainfall draining to your bioretention cell. That has to be stored in 12 inches or less above the planting surface. Now, let's say there's a local requirement that you need to provide peak attenuation for the 10-year storm. Your peak attenuation volume can be 24 inches above the bottom, as long as your peak attenuation outlet is 18 inches above. So that would be shown using routing calculations that with that design elevation of your outlet, that your peak attenuation volume is going to be less than 24 inches above the bottom surface. Or yes, the top of the planting surface. Media depth is another one that gets confusing for some people because it's different depending on the vegetation. If there's trees and shrubs proposed, then you need at least 36 inches of media. If there are no trees and shrubs proposed, it can be 24 inches if there's no internal water storage, or it has to be 30 inches if there is internal water storage. So the only way that you can have a bioretention cell without internal water storage is if the in situ soil infiltration rate is greater than 2 inches per hour. So in those cases, we consider an infiltrating bioretention cell, and you don't need to put internal water storage in. MDC 6 and 7 are the medium mixture and p-index. This is a very specific mix that is used for the design of bioretention cells to make sure that you're going to be able to support the plant life and remove the pollutants. And the p-index is used to make sure that you're not going to be leaching phosphorus out into the system. So these should both be specified on the plans. You should show what the organic matter is. And when we're saying organic matter, we're not counting any mulch that's put on top of the bioretention cell. An MDC 10 for bioretention cells is a planting plan. So that just says that you have to submit a planting plan by an appropriate design professional. And a lot of the time it's just sod. Use a non-clumping, deep-rooted species that's not grown in an impermeable liner. If it's trees and shrubs, then you have to show that you're going to get 75% plant coverage after 5 years. Obviously, that's something that you can't necessarily guarantee up front. So that's a situation where you might just add an extra requirement to the maintenance plan to show that you're going to be able to do that. Wet ponds are also very common, SCM. So one of the common things that we see is people don't give us the right main pool depth. The main pool depth is actually calculated using either equation 2 or 3. Those are both from the wet pond chapter. It is not equal to the physical depth. So we don't want to see that your permanent pool is 3 feet above the bottom. It pretty much always has to be more than 3 feet. And you have to use one of these two calculations to show that the average depth of the main pool is going to be 3 feet or greater. MDC 3 is sediment storage. It says that you have to have a minimum sediment storage depth of 6 inches. This should be in addition to that main pool depth. So you should be able to design the system. You get your main pool depth that's 3 feet or above, 3 to 8 feet, and then excavate 6 inches deeper to provide storage for sediment. All wet ponds require a forebay. The forebay has these 4 specific requirements. It has to be 15 to 20% of the main pool volume. The entrance has to be deeper than the forebay exit, meaning the depth at the inlet pipe from the bottom of the forebay to the water surface should be deeper than at the weir or whatever the control structure is that allows runoff to go from the forebay into the main pool. And we also have the sediment accumulation requirement. Again, that's a maintenance issue. That's usually addressed just by cleaning the forebay when the sediment storage is full. And wet pond MDC 7 says that it has to drain within 2 to 5 days. So that drawdown time is based on the water quality event. So a lot of times people will use a wet pond for peak attenuation and say, okay, my 2-year storm drains in 2.5 days. Well, that's not what we're looking for to meet that 2 to 5 day requirement. We want to see that the volume from the water quality event will drain within 2 to 5 days. Sand filter, also very common SCM. I mentioned earlier, there's seasonal high water table separation, so you need to submit a geotechnical investigation for that. MDC 2 and 3 require that there's 2 chambers, a sediment chamber and a sand chamber. The storage volume is equivalent, and that you can store 0.75 times the treatment volume in that system. So in this case, you'd calculate the water quality volume, provide enough storage for 75% of that. We want to allow people to use sand filters also for peak attenuation. So even though SCM or MDC2 says the storage volume has to be equivalent, we're okay with you oversizing the sediment chamber as long as at least half of that runoff can be stored in the sand chamber above the sand surface. MDC 6 is the sand media specification. The sand media has to be ASTM C33 or the equivalent. It should cover the entire bottom of the sand chamber, and it should be specified on the plans that that's the sand required for the sand filter. And then the media depth, you have to have 18 inches of that sand. The minimum depth above the underdrain pipe shall be 12 inches. And what that means is you have to have 18 inches everywhere throughout the sand filter, but if the underdrain pipe is embedded in the sand instead of in a stone layer under the sand, then you have to have at least 12 inches above that underdrain pipe. All right, we're almost there. Permeable pavement is the last one. Again, separation from the seasonal high water table. You have to have a geotechnical investigation. For permeable pavement, there's the option of making it infiltrating or making it underdrained. If it's infiltrating, then you also have to establish the hydraulic conductivity. MDC 7 is runoff from adjacent areas. This is the one that trips people up the most. You need to actually show the grading for any adjacent areas that are draining onto your permeable pavement. And the additional adjacent BUA contributing runoff cannot exceed a 1-to-1 ratio. So what that means is if you have 1 acre of permeable pavement, you can have up to 1 additional acre for a total of 2 acres draining to that permeable pavement area. That doesn't apply to screened rooftop runoff. So if you're going to use that, you need to just show a collection system and provide a detail showing that that's going to be screened. And the last issue for a permeable pavement is that we provide this BUA credit if you have something that can infiltrate the entire water quality event. It's not considered built upon area towards meeting the high and low density threshold. So this is a way that a lot of people with residential subdivisions will maybe expand a driveway or something like that without going over the built upon area limit. But that needs to be shown to us on the plans. We need to make sure that you're actually designing it to infiltrate that entire runoff volume. So when you're presenting it to us, we want to see all of the separate drainage areas, the SCMs, and the application documents. When sizing the permeable pavement system, you have to consider the permeable pavement system itself as built upon area, even if it's infiltrating, because of course, 100% of the rain falling on it is going to go into it. And you don't get credit for that until the SCM is approved. We've reviewed it to make sure that it meets the MDC. So that's it for the general MDC. I know I had to, or the Scm Specific Mdc. I'm sorry I had to run through that so quickly, but I'll take any questions I have at the end, or you can always reach out to me afterwards. There are final submittal requirements. We don't have a closeout process because the post-construction permit is in effect in perpetuity, but we do have the requirements that once the project is complete, we need a designer certification that says that it was built in accordance with the plans. We need a copy of recorded deed restrictions and protective covenants, a copy of any recorded drainage easements, and the O&M agreement has to be referenced on the final plat and recorded with the County Register of Deeds. And I'm done. It's 11:59. I apologize that I took longer than I planned. There was a lot of information. I thought I would be able to get through it a little quicker. But if anybody has any questions, feel free.
Okay, Annette, would you like to say a few words since we don't have any questions? Can't hear you. Annette, you're on mute. Still can't hear you. I'm so sorry. Can you try now? Hey, Corey, move the ball back to me, please.
Okay, 1 second. All right, there you go.
Okay, and can you see if you can unmute yourself? I still can't hear you. I'm so sorry. Okay, well, we'll just go ahead on. I don't know why we can't hear Annette. We'll just go ahead on and wrap up the meeting. I know she wants to tell you guys thank you for tuning in once again, and definitely wanted to remind you guys about the upcoming webinar that's on May 19th. We'll be sending some additional information out for that. And also just want to let everybody know that the link is in the chat. To go ahead and complete your evaluation if you're needing credit for PDH hours. I'll hang on a little while in case somebody have questions if they think of one afterwards, and I will email those to Corey and Jim, and we will make sure that they get answered, each and every one of you, and send you an email individually. So if that's it, thank you guys again for showing up. We had a total of 158 people that attended this webinar, and we're just so glad for your participation each month. You guys have a wonderful rest of the day and an even more wonderful rest of the week. Thanks, guys.